How's it going, guys? My name is Zach with the Movie Castle, and today we're going to be taking a look at Hammer, House of Horror. This is episode 13. This one's entitled The Mark of Satan, and originally aired on December 6, 1980. And this is actually the last episode of the show. This is the finale, so that means we've talked about every single episode. That's pretty cool. I really did enjoy this series. Sad to see it go, but it does definitely end on a high note. This is directed by Don Lever, and if that name sounds familiar, he's the guy who directed the first episode, so it's cool to see him book in the series. This episode stars Peter McEnery, Gorgina, Hale, and Emrys James. And this is about a guy, he has a low-level position in the morgue, he's a new guy, and one day they get in this body. This is the body of a guy who tried to drill into his skull to let the devil out. And after this happens to him, our main character starts to see a bunch of curious things that don't quite add up. In particular, the number 9 is repeated everywhere around him in his everyday life. And he starts to not feel so good, and he has a suspicion that there's a conspiracy against him. All the people in his life are plotting against him, and they're trying to create a disease made up of pure evil. So, lots of really big and crazy stuff. It's also worth noting, I believe this episode was only showed on TV one time, and in the American releases of Hammer House of Horror, it was quite often cut off. This is the banned episode. And I can see why. I totally don't think it should have been banned. I really don't like banned and censored content. But I understand why this was the one, in particular with what the guy feels compelled to do towards the end of the episode. This episode really does go for it. There's something really big that happens about halfway into this episode, and I'm like, wow, normally that would be the end of the episode, but it happens about 33 minutes into a 51-minute episode, and we still have a bunch of time to go on. And by the time this gets to the end, everything gets so big and crazy and surreal with like shades of Rosemary's Baby there. And you really start to feel for this guy, because even though this does talk about a conspiracy, it's really more a human-centered story at heart. There's this guy, he doesn't have a proper support network. His only family is his mother, and they're not on great terms, and he doesn't have a whole bunch of friends, and in turn, he gets stress at his new job. He doesn't feel fulfillment in his life. And when life starts pushing into him, and he doesn't have that support network, you can see just how quickly the human mind goes down this really dark and dangerous path. It's quite scary, you know? And you see how quickly he falls into the number conspiracy, and how quickly he starts to suspect that something's up, and it's really, really big. And yeah, it does go crazy. This is a really good depiction of a descent into madness, and this episode itself is really dark and disturbing and goes for it pretty hard at the end. Now, I believe, I haven't seen it yet, there's a Jim Carrey movie, The Number 23, one of his dramatic movies, not a funny one. And I believe The Number 23 is kind of similar to this. I haven't seen it yet, though, but now that I've rewatched this episode, I plan to watch it pretty soon. So if you guys want to stick around, there should be a review for that coming up. I'm looking forward to it. But anyway, this was a pretty high episode to go out on. It's sad that it was banned in so many places for so long, because it really is one of the series' better episodes. I definitely would put it in the top 5. I have to think about my exact order, but this is a really hard-hitting episode, and I thought it was really, really well made, really, really striking. Without further ado, let's talk a bit about the plot and more specifics. I'm not going to be doing any major spoilers, but I do want to analyze the plot. I'll just be avoiding how the story ends. Anyway, the pre-credit scene, this one opens up with brain surgery, so already pretty deep going into it. Brain surgery, and this guy screams right before he dies, "Leave my soul alone." And then he's dead. That is such a good, dark opening there. That's pretty cool. But anyway, after the credits, he's dead, and his body goes to the morgue, and we meet our main character. He was working up in surgery, but he got transferred down here. I don't know his exact position. He's a nurse or an orderly or something. But he's the new guy, pretty low level. And he's there, and they show him the body. And they start to do the autopsy. And you get this doctor here, that waxes very poetic and talks about all sorts of crazy things. Later on in the episode, he'll tell this story about how one of the nurses was putting a brain in a jar away and realized the brain was of her own mother. So yeah, he's the kind of guy that tells weird stories like that and starts to think about things. So rather than just doing the autopsy, he talks about how this guy thought he had the devil in his head and wanted to drill it out. And he starts to talk about it and think about why he could have done this. And, even though he doesn't really believe there was anything magical going on, he starts to speculate about what could have happened. And he starts to analyze it quite a bit, and that's getting our character pulled into this gruesome, macabre story going on. Anyway, when they're done with the autopsy, they say, "Hey, put him in drawer number 9. And that's going to be one of the things with this episode. The number 9. You see, he puts him in the drawer number 9, but earlier that day he had won a raffle and he was supposed to get 16 pounds. There was a mix-up. He only got 9 pounds. Later on in the episode, they'll tell him when he does his stitching, 9 stitches to every 3 inches, and then he pricks his finger. But again, the number 9, he also lives in house number 9 on his street, and he starts to see the 9s around a whole lot more. He'll start to do math based on the letters in your name, and he'll get 9s, and he'll see 9s in license plates and numbers that add up to 9. And when you get to the point where you're adding the numbers together, you can see that this guy is really going into it pretty hard. So yeah, he's seeing 9s everywhere, and he's thinking something's up. There's a conspiracy. Someone is working against him. And there's a weatherman outside of his office. And the weatherman's making weird noises, and he thinks the police are using this as a secret radio tower, and they're trying to broadcast some signal. They're trying to warn me about something. So yeah, we're going pretty far down a disturbed path. And his life really isn't that great. He's the new guy, and one of his other bosses, his manager, I guess, is always telling him what he's doing wrong. Don't move that tag. It has to stay on the body the whole time. You don't want to mix things up. And he pricks his finger. Whoa, you just used iodine. You have to go and clean it up properly, and you need several shots now, So his manager's always breathing down his neck. And his home life isn't really great either. He has a feud with his mother. His mother's really old, can't really hear that well, very cranky. And they have a tenant living with them in one of their spare rooms. And the tenant is a single mother with a baby. And his mother hates the tenant. Can you believe what young girls are doing nowadays? And the tenant is determined to survive at any cost. So she'll flirt with him a little bit and then suggest, "Don't you think your mother's getting kind of old? Maybe it's time you put her in a home. It would be for her own good." So you can really see she's willing to play the game for her own survival. And I really thought she was an interesting character, especially an unforeseen direction towards the end. Something happens, a little after the midway point, and I'm like, that is interesting. I wouldn't suspect that she would do that. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff happens. But also, he realizes his dad, who had died before the episode started, had died of a sickness with similar symptoms to what he's feeling now. And he thinks, what if this conspiracy killed my dad, and what they did to him, they're trying to do to me? They're trying to make a disease, and it's a disease of pure evil. So pretty big scaled stuff there. And like he goes to a church and the pastor tries to calm him down, but then he sees the sermons and it's all 9 or stuff that adds up to 9, and he's like, I gotta get out of here. And let me tell you, a lot happens in this episode. Like I said, a big thing happens at about the halfway point that you would have expected to be the end, but it keeps going and it keeps snowballing, and you really feel sorry for this poor guy, and you really wish he had a real friend or something. And this episode goes pretty hard, and it's one of those that you're like, how did they accomplish so much in an hour-long television block? Like, a lot of movies don't even do this much, and it spirals towards the end, and the poor guy is really put through the ringer. It gets really extreme, really psychological, and one of the things they suggest that he should do towards the end, the figures in his head, is pretty dark, and you understand why this episode got banned. But overall, I really like it. I think it's one of the show's best episodes. Really got a lot of psychological weight, and you feel for this poor guy, and it talks about real world stuff, like people that, you know, don't have a support network of friends and family, and how easily a terrible situation can derail their life. And really, on top of all that too, a possible conspiracy angle. Lots of cool stuff happens in here, and I really do like this episode. And overall, one of the best, and a really strong finale for Hammer House of Horror. To everyone who's watched so far, thank you for watching. To everyone who's liked and subscribed, thank you. You really are helping the channel out. I'll leave a relevant playlist on the bottom. This should be my Hammer House of Horror playlist. And as of now, I've talked about every single episode of the show. So if you want to see me talk about any other ones, those will be in there as well. Also, next week I'll probably do an episode ranking review, so a little bit more from this series. Anyway, have a good day. I'll see you guys again very soon. Hammer House of Horror playlist on the bottom. Have a good day now.